After studying this module, you shall be able to know the elements of effective regulation, learn about the structure of regulatory institutions, identify the differences between cost plus regulation and price cap regulation, analyze more practical regulation of infrastructure services. Many infrastructure activities in developing and transition economies already involve substantial competition, but others have little or none, though that may soon change. For two main reasons, industries lacking competition require regulation. First, to ensure fair treatment of customers who lack the protection that comes with competition. Second, to ensure that competitors have fair access to bottleneck network facilities controlled by incumbent service providers. If incumbents do not face regulatory constraints, they can use these facilities to destroy or control their rivals. Thus, regulation plays a central role in subjecting network utilities to competition. Government also have a permanent role in enforcing anti-monopoly and antitrust policies, which ensure that competition is not suppressed by private monopoly power or by collusion among or combinations of competitors. So, one of the biggest challenges for policy makers in developing and transition economies is managing the shift from state ownership and control of infrastructure operations to more independent regulatory oversight. Next is the evolution and elements of effective regulation. Credible, stable regulation is required to achieve the benefits of privatizing and liberalizing infrastructure. Many developing and transition economies lack the institutional prerequisites for effective regulation, including separation of powers, especially between the executive and the judiciary, well-functioning, credible political and economic institutions, and an independent judiciary, a legal system that safeguards private property from state or regulatory seizure without fair compensation, and relies on judicial review to protect against regulatory abuse of basic principles of fairness. Norms and laws supported by institutions that delegate authority to a bureaucracy and enable it to act relatively independently. Strong contract laws and mechanisms for resolving contract disputes. Sound administrative procedures that provide broad access to their regulatory process and make it transparent. Sufficient professional staff trained in relevant economic, accounting and legal principles. Next is the institutional requirements. The structure and process of infrastructure regulation determine how effectively it supports reforms and promotes efficiency and other social objectives. Coherence. Regulations for each infrastructure sector should be complementary and mutually supportive. The laws guiding regulation must be in agreement and regulations must be consistent over time. Regulatory coherence requires that national regulators, ministries and provincial and municipal regulators have clearly defined responsibilities, ensuring that the same agency always makes decisions involving specific aspects of regulation. Next, independence. Effective regulation requires that regulators be largely free from political influence, especially on a day-to-day or decision-by-decision basis. Compromise is needed to ensure that regulators are both independent and responsive to an elected administration policy goals. Safeguards that can help achieve such compromise include giving the regulator statutory authority free of ministerial control, setting clear professional criteria for appointing regulators, requiring that both the executive and legislative branches participate in appointments, appointing regulators for fixed periods and prohibiting their removal without clearly defined cause, subject to formal review, staggering the terms of an agency's board members so that they can be replaced only gradually by successive administrations, funding agency operations with user fees or levies on service providers to insulate agencies from political interference through the budget process, exempting agencies from civil service salary caps to enable them to attract and retain well-qualified staff, prohibiting the executive branch from overturning an agency's decision except through new legislation or judicial appeals of existing laws. Next is accountability. A regulator's independence should be reconciled with its accountability. It is difficult to strike a proper balance between independence and accountability, but certain measures can help. Writing statutes that specify the rights and responsibilities of each regulatory agency and distinguish between primary and secondary objectives when there are multiple goals. Subjecting agency decisions to review by courts or another non-political entity. Requiring regulators to produce annual reports on their activities and subjecting their performance to formal reviews by independent auditors or legislative committees. Removing regulators that act inappropriately or incompetently. Allowing stakeholders to submit their views on matters under review and requiring regulators to publish their decisions and the reasons behind them. Next, transparency. Infrastructure regulation is an important policy issue, and in a democracy, all citizens need transparent information about it to evaluate government performance. Next is predictability. Regulatory agencies are predictable if they follow the rule of law, particularly respect for precedent and the principle of stare decisis. Respect for precedent means that regulators reverse past decisions only if they have created significant problems. Stare decisis requires that cases with the same underlying facts be decided the same way every time. Thus, regulatory decisions must be based on durable rules and regulations that will apply in future cases unless new information is obtained. Next, capacity. A regulatory agency's responsibilities should match its financial and human resources. Available financing reflects government willingness to support independent regulatory institutions, but with the possible exception of very small and poor countries, lack of financial capacity is unlikely to be a genuine constraint, though failure to provide adequate financing for regulation is a more common problem. Next in discussion is the structure of regulatory institutions. Centralized or decentralized. Designing regulation involves trade-offs. For example, decentralization making lower levels of government responsible for regulating utilities offer several advantages. It allows local conditions and preferences to shape regulation, moves regulators closer to services, allowing them to gather better information on users, promotes competition among subnational regulators to attract private investment, may improve enforcement of regulatory decisions. But centralization also has advantages. A national regulatory structure makes the best use of scarce expertise and minimizes the fixed cost of regulation, such as those of maintaining regional offices. Centralization can also reduce the risk of a regulatory race to the bottom, as when jurisdictions competing for investment take on excessive financial risk or lower their environmental standards. And centralization may be necessary if jurisdictions are too small to support an efficient scale or scope of operations for certain industries. Analysis of the cost and benefits of either approach must reflect the country's institutional structure and the industry's technological features. Still, several general conclusions can be drawn. First, small or poor countries may have only one effective tier of government. Large or rich countries have far greater potential for decentralization and more options in assigning different regulatory tasks to different tiers of government. But while multi-tiered approaches are the norm in large industrial industries, they increase the complexity of establishing new systems in developing and transition economies. Second, spillovers over jurisdiction and industry boundaries depend on the industry. Multiple agencies or just one. If regulatory responsibilities are assigned to a single tier of government, the government creates industry specific regulators or a single agency with a broader mandate. Establishing separate agencies has advantages. It recognizes the unique economic and technological characteristics of each infrastructure industry and enables regulators to develop industry specific expertise. It also mitigates the risk of institutional failure and encourages innovative responses to regulatory challenges. But there are also benefits to using one regulator for several industries. Doing so makes it possible to share fixed cost, scarce talent and other resources. Consolidation also builds expertise in cross-cutting regulatory issues, administering tariff adjustment rules, introducing competition in monopolistic industries and managing relationships with stakeholders. So, deciding on the breadth of regulatory coverage involves numerous considerations and no single approach will suit all circumstances. First, in economics, with a small base of consumers, not necessarily population and limited human and financial resources, there is a strong argument for merging regulatory responsibilities. Second, regulators in developing and transition economies typically have less discretion than their counterparts in industrial countries. Multi-industry agencies with narrower responsibilities raise fewer concerns about inadequate industry focus or potential diseconomies of scale. Third, if market substitution can occur between the output of regulated industries, especially between electricity and gas, but also between modes of transportation and telecommunications, economic distortions may arise from inconsistent regulation of common issues. Thus, the case for consolidating regulatory responsibility may be stronger for some industries. Fourth, the scarcity of expertise and vulnerability to politics and industry captured in developing and transition economies also strengthen arguments for multi-industry regulation. Finally, different reform strategies place different demands on new regulatory agencies, affecting their ability to develop expertise and maintain focus. One common strategy is staggered reform, where the government reforms utility industries sequentially over time. This strategy allows a new regulatory agency to focus initially on one industry and build up experience. Next, the importance of regulatory commitment. Regulation that can sustain private investment in infrastructure does more than serve the interest of investors. It also promotes competition and increases access to basic services. Such regulation must be clear and credible, ensuring investors that regulators are committed to fair, consistent and sustainable policies and procedures. Next, commitment through administrative procedures. In some countries, utility regulation is based on well-defined administrative procedures. These procedures determine how regulatory agencies make substantive decisions and define mechanisms for appealing them. By specifying the institutional environment for decision making, procedural requirements limit regulators' ranges of policy decisions and so their discretion. Next, commitment through concession contracts. In some infrastructure sectors, telecommunications, electricity generation, gas production, ownership has been transferred to the private sector through outright divestiture. In others, water and sewerage, transportation, electricity transmission and distribution, gas transportation and distribution, legal, political and constitutional restraints have hindered the transfer of ownership to the private sector. As a result, many countries have used innovative strategies to facilitate private participation in those sectors. Concession, lease or affirmage, and to a much lesser extent management contracts have emerged as attractive alternatives to outright privatization. A concession contract grants a private company, typically through competitive bidding, the exclusive right to provide a service for a specified period by using existing facilities and developing new ones. Thus, a concession agreement entails only a temporary transfer of assets to the private sector. At the end of the concession period, the assets are transferred back to the public authority. Next, commitment with substantive economic restraints. Government discretion can be limited by having regulators publicly articulate the basic economic principles that guide their policy decisions. These principles would allow space for regulation to adapt to changing market conditions and require regulators to refrain from unilaterally imposing policy or rule that changes undercut promised investment value, refrain from intervening in activities of regulated firms that relate to competitive markets or at least markets not identified as protected natural monopolies. Avoid expanding regulatory interventions without demonstrating that the benefits outweigh the cost. Ensure competitive service quality and prices by avoiding privatization deals that results in higher prices than necessary, allowing consumers to challenge deals that result in higher prices in return for higher government revenue, using price cap mechanisms to control regulated monopoly prices, and allowing consumers to seek rate adjustments if service quality falls far short of that promised in a privatization agreement. Provide consumers suppliers of complementary and substitute services, suppliers of inputs, and investors with signals and incentives for efficient actions by ensuring that prices reflect the value and marginal cost of services and by giving service providers pricing flexibility. Require infrastructure monopolists to give rivals open access to their bottleneck facilities at prices with the same markups as the competing services sold by these monopolists. Pay competitively neutral attention to social goals pertinent to each infrastructure sector by targeting subsidies as much as possible and requiring that any surcharges or taxes imposed have equal effects on the prices charged by competing suppliers. Next, balancing commitment and flexibility. To encourage efficient performance, a regulatory system must be able to adapt its mandate and rules in response to new challenges, circumstances, information, and experiences. Such flexibility is especially imperative in sectors experiencing rapid technological and market changes. Next, mechanisms to regulate prices. 5 basic goals should design the price regulation. Rent extraction, setting rates that strike a socially acceptable compromise between the interest of investors and consumers. Supply side efficiency, providing signals and incentives for suppliers and investors to increase efficiency. Demand side efficiency, providing signals and incentives for efficient consumption of regulated utility services. Revenue adequacy, allowing regulated firms to earn sufficient revenue to attract needed capital. Fairness, ensuring that prices are just and reasonable and contribute to universal service goals without creating significant distortions. These goals cannot all be achieved simultaneously. Indeed, practical regulation entails trade-offs among them. Two alternative mechanisms for regulating prices are cost plus and price caps. This section analyzes these approaches and their likely implications for pricing policies. Cost plus regulation. Policymakers have been attracted to this mode of controlling utility behavior because it seems fair to both the regulated firm and its customers. It permits the firm to earn sufficient revenues, including a fair return on its investment, by passing its cost on to consumers through the prices charged. It is also designed to protect consumers from monopolistic pricing distortions. One of the attractions of cost plus systems is that they are likely to attract investment to a regulated sector because investors know they will recover their operating and investment cost, perhaps with a return that exceeds their cost of capital. These systems shift a variety of firm and market-specific risk to consumers, satisfying the goal of revenue adequacy. Moreover, by holding revenues close to cost, cost plus systems keep utility services reasonably affordable. These are important considerations given the socio-economic characteristics of many developing and transition economies and their substantial requirements for infrastructure investment. Still, cost plus systems have shortcomings. The firm has an incentive to engage in accounting controversies and to pay its cost to convince the regulator to approve higher prices. These systems allow considerable scope for such behavior. A range of estimates is possible due to conventions for calculating depreciation, procedures for allocating joint cost between regulated and unregulated outputs, and procedures for calculating capital cost. Unless the regulator has a well-developed cost accounting system to audit the firm's cost, the firm can misrepresent them. If that happens, the regulator will set prices too high, frustrating its rent extraction goal. Moreover, in the presence of asymmetric information about the firm's capabilities and the level of managerial effort and other costs it must incur to realize a specified level of operating efficiency. A pure cost plus regime distorts the firm's incentives to minimize its cost, even if the regulator has sophisticated auditing technology. Because the firm is not rewarded for reducing cost, it has no incentive to do so. In addition, the firm has incentives to expand its rate base by adopting excessively capital intensive technology. So, although consumers pay prices that just cover the firm's cost, such cost may be too high. As a result, rent may accrue to the firm's managers, employees and input suppliers, undermining supply side efficiency. The tendency of prices to adjust slowly to changing cost, commonly referred to as regulatory lag, restores some of the incentives for efficiency lost under a pure cost plus system. By partly decoupling prices from cost, the regulatory lag imposes penalties for inefficiency and incorrect guesses and rewards efficiency by permitting the firm to keep the profits it earns from cutting cost and improving performance. Moreover, regulators normally have the authority to disallow operating and capital cost that they find imprudent or unnecessary. The threat of disallowing such cost encourages the firm to make efficient production decisions. Next is price cap incentive regulation. Given the weak incentives for productive efficiency under cost plus regulation, many types of incentive based regulation have been developed. In essence, the regulator delegates certain performance related decisions to the firm and the firm's profit depend on its performance as measured by the regulator. Price caps are the main incentive mechanism. Their key purpose is to control the prices, not the earnings of the regulated firm. Thus, this form of regulation does not make explicit use of accounting data. Under price caps, the regulator defines a set of prices or a weighted average of prices for different services that the firm will be allowed to charge. The firm is free to price at or below these ceilings. Estimates the ability of firms in the regulated industry to limit cost increases and compares that with firms in other industries. The estimated differential in productivity between the regulated industry and the rest of the economy is called the X factor. Specifies a formula for adjusting prices or the weighted average price over time to reflect input inflation, easily observable changes in cost beyond the firm's control, and the expected rate of productivity improvement X factor. Thus, price cap regulation severs the link between the firm's authorized prices and its realized cost. In a typical price cap plan, related services and products are grouped into categories often referred to as baskets. Alternatively, all services may be bundled in a single basket. An overall price cap is set for each basket. This index ceiling is usually a weighted average price for all regulated services in the basket. Moreover, the firm can set the price of any service in a basket as long as it does not exceed the index ceiling. All the restrictions are often imposed on the prices of individual services to protect specific groups of consumers or promote socially important services. Thus, the firm can rebalance its prices over time. In a pure price cap regime, the firm's realized cost and profits do not enter into the regulatory contract. Once the index ceiling and its path is set, they are not changed. The firm has strong incentives to pursue cost reducing innovation, use the lowest cost technology, operate with no waste, and report its cost truthfully. At the same time, consumers are protected because prices do not vary with the firm's reported cost. Actual price cap regulation, however, is not as straightforward as the theoretical case. Price caps do not last indefinitely. It is standard for a price cap mechanism to be reviewed after a stipulated period, often 3 to 5 years. Such a review could lead to a revision of the basic parameters of the price cap formula, such as the X factor. If a firm realizes strong earnings under the initial regime, the review could also lead to more demanding standards being placed on the firm by raising the X factor. Moreover, unless prohibited by law, the regulator could conduct a full earnings audit to recalibrate prices so that expected future earnings move toward a target rate of return. So while the firm's earnings do not directly affect prices under a pure price cap regime, most price cap plans include provisions for adjusting prices if the rate of return falls outside a given range. When strong efficiency gains cause an increase in future productivity offsets, it dulls the firm's incentives to cut cost and improve performance. This reduction in incentives becomes more pronounced if the price cap regime is reviewed more frequently. Still, the regulator is not supposed to intervene in the firm's pricing decisions during the review period, implying that the firm has an incentive to cut its cost faster than was envisaged when the X factor was set, because by doing so, it can keep the resulting high profits. It also implies that in setting the period between price reviews, there is a trade-off between providing incentives for efficiency, supply-side efficiency goal, and reducing excess profit rent extraction goal. The longer is the period, the greater are the benefits for the firm. The shorter is the period, the greater are the benefits for consumers because they do not benefit from cost reductions until the price cap is reset. Very short periods will make the price cap system look like rate of return regulation. There are grounds for expecting a ratcheting up effect in the price cap system as the end of the review period approaches. The firm will ease off its cost reducing activities so that the reset caps will reflect its higher cost. Price caps offer regulators a variety of choices. Which services will be subject to a price cap? Which services will be used to construct the price index? Will certain cost increase be automatically passed on to the consumers, and if so, to what extent? Next is hybrid regimes. Most practical regulatory regimes are hybrid schemes that involve trade-offs between supply side efficiency, capital attraction, rent extraction, and demand side efficiency. These mechanisms aim to share cost benefits and burdens between the regulated firm and its customers. For example, under some profit sharing mechanisms, the firm is allowed to keep all profits as long as the rate of return revenue falls within a specified range. That approach retains incentives for firms to achieve cost efficiency. But if the rate of return falls outside this range, consumers receive a portion of the gain or loss, weakening the firm's incentives. Overall, incentives for cost efficiency are stronger under such profit sharing schemes than under rate of return regulation, but weaker than under price caps. Similarly, institutionalized regularity lag restores some of the incentives for cost efficiency lost under the rate of return regulation. Next, choosing between rate of return and price cap regulation. From a public policy perspective, the choice between rate of return and price cap regulation is an empirical question. Comparative linking of prices to cost. One area where the difference between the two mechanisms has been exaggerated is the extent to which they link prices to cost, and hence their different implications for the trade-off between incentives for supply side efficiency and rent extraction. Under price cap regulation, prices are not linked to cost, and incentives for lowering cost are strongest if the cap is never reset. But that approach is politically untenable if the regulated firm earns extremely high profits at any point. Moreover, nearly every price cap regime is periodically updated at preset intervals. Regulators typically use these updates to eliminate excessive returns and to pass on to consumers through lower prices a portion of the efficiency gains the firm made in the previous period. Even if political considerations are discounted when setting a price cap, the regulator has to forecast future costs and revenues to ensure that the firm will be financially viable. Otherwise, having no link between prices and cost could bankrupt the firm and disrupt service. Price cap regulation with periodic updates is similar to rate of return regulation with regulatory lag. Cost plus rate of return regulation, on the other hand, never involves ongoing hearings. The process typically involves periodic reporting of profits and other service measures. Hearings are initiated by firms, regulators, or interested third parties, with firms being the most common source of request. Inflation is an important determinant of the frequency of reviews. When inflation is low, reviews are infrequent. Next, comparative price flexibility. In theory, price cap regulation controls only the firm's average prices, leaving it free to change individual prices in each basket of services. By contrast, prices are rigid under rate of return regulation. But in practice, the difference between the two schemes is not as pronounced. In addition to its overall price controls, price cap regulation often limits price changes for individual services. with separate baskets and basket-specific restrictions, price increases in one basket might not be allowed even if they are offset by reductions in another basket. These types of restrictions can severely limit a firm's pricing flexibility under price caps. Moreover, under cost plus regulation, firms have some flexibility in pricing non-core services. They often also have the authority to cut prices and to raise them through automatic adjustment formulas. Next, comparative regulatory discretion. Price cap reviews give regulators significant discretion over future policies. By contrast, under a rate of return regime, the regulator has a statutory obligation to ensure that the regulated firm earns a fair return. This commitment implies that rate of return regimes are less prone to renegotiation than price caps. Next, comparative information and human capital requirements. Most developing and transition economies do not have well-established cost accounting and auditing systems, and as noted, they often lack regulatory expertise. Thus, the information and human capital requirements of different regulatory mechanisms are important. Given typical inflation rates in these countries, hearings could be common under rate of return regulation. At the end of each review period, price caps require similar information as rate of return systems. They also require forecast of relevant variables through the next review. So, setting up and revising price caps requires the same type of professional skills as a rate of return system. But far less professional input is received between reviews. The regulator only has to verify compliance with the price cap by monitoring changes in a well-defined price index. Thus, price caps will likely require much less information overall. Next, the choice in practice. The optimal choice among regulatory mechanisms depends on a variety of factors: the quality of accounting and auditing systems, the availability of economic and technical expertise, the efficacy of the tax system, the sector's investment requirements, the government commitment powers, institutional checks and balances, and overall macroeconomic stability. Some of these will change over time. Thus, different stages of national development have implications for the choice of regulatory regimes. During the first stage of regulation with scarce expertise and poor auditing and monitoring, price caps with provisions for adjustment are likely the best choice. Initial prices might need to be high to attract capital and ensure firm viability, but increased investment and supply side efficiency should compensate for them. This stage should be used to improve regulatory capacity and accounting and auditing systems. Once these conditions have been met, the second stage can promote cost plus mechanisms that facilitate large-scale sustainable investment, especially if government credibility improves at a slower pace, and achieve the rent extraction goal in the face of continuing high cost of public funds. As development continues with the complete infrastructure system expansion and enhanced commitment powers, the optimal solution is to move to hybrid regulation. Regulation that provides a credible commitment to safeguarding the interest of both investors and customers, particularly when economic shocks create political pressure to shift the balance of power among competing interest groups, is crucial to attracting the long-term private capital needed to secure an adequate, reliable supply of infrastructure services. Successful reform requires regulation that clarifies property rights, allocates them sensibly, and assures private investors that their sunk investments will not be subject to regulatory opportunism. For regulation to promote welfare by facilitating investment, innovation, and allocatively efficient pricing, its constitutional design and substantive content must be consistent with country circumstances. particularly the country's size, institutional endowments including checks and balances, technical expertise, auditing technologies, fiscal condition and tax system efficacy, and the economic characteristics of its industries.